say something? Okay, good. Okay. This hearing will come to order. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for a topic that does not get the attention it deserves in Congress. The word dystopia is frequently used to describe the Chinese Communist Party's repression in the northwest of China. There's good reason for this. What's happening there should be confined to science fiction, but unfortunately it's not. The party calls this region Xinjiang, and those who live there sometimes refer to it as East Turkestan. The Uyghurs, a Turkic Muslim people, have historically been the region's majority population and remain a plurality. Xinjiang falls along the Silk Road. Its capital is closer to Kabul and Beijing, and it remains culturally and ethnically distinct from China. The People's Liberation Army brought the Xinjiang into a modern-day People Republic of China in 1949 by invasion. Today, the party is seeking to eliminate Xinjiang's uniqueness using methods ripped straight from fiction. Authorities have turned the region into a high-tech, militarized police state using cutting-edge technology to subject normal people to pervasive surveillance, including AI, facial and voice recognition, and forced genetic sampling. Authorities compile vast amounts of data on individuals and assign them arbitrary scores, which can drastically alter their lives. In some areas, there are police outposts every few feet. Information, communication, and travel are restricted. Astoundingly, about 1 million people are being detained in rapidly expanding networks of concentration camps, where they are forced to undergo so-called political re-education. That can only be described as brainwashing, brutality, torture, and death. For those who are targeted, even fleeing will not keep them safe. PRC authorities surveil them abroad and punish their families to coerce their silence or force their return. The party has used the specter of terrorism to excuse their abuses and scapegoat the victims. But the truth is, the victims are men and women, young and old, from every walk of life. They are targeted based on extremism. They are not targeted based on extremism. They are targeted based on their religion and ethnicity. The party's so-called strike hard campaigns are specifically intended to surveil, profile, punish, and round up the Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and any Turkic Muslim whose lives are distinct from the party's vision of what it means to be Chinese. The CCP, the Chinese Communist Party's actions, are transparently seeking to destroy normal Islamic religious practices, the Uyghur culture and language, and even genetic concentration of Uyghur heritage in the Xinjiang. Chillingly, the party says their objective is ethnic harmony. Ethnic harmony. Sounds nice. Based on their action, it seems that ethnic harmony means that one is allowed to be different, means that no one is allowed to be different from the atheists, Mandarin-speaking, ardently socialist Han nation. The greatest tragedy of the 20th century occurred when the world stood by as cruel nationalist parties targeted an ethnic minority as part of an evil plan to re-engineer society. Whether it is the genocide of Rwanda, Sudan, or as the full committee highlighted earlier today in Burma, the world has a poor record of stopping genocide or ethnic cleansing. We did have that hearing this morning, and it's just unconscionable that we talk about never again will we allow what happened under the Hitler regime, yet here we are 70 years roughly later, and it's happening over and over again. It is my hope that we can help shine a light on what could be the next of these blights on humanity. As another totalitarian regime, is building crematoriums near its concentration camps, We must speak out with the loudest possible voice. Can there be a clear warning sign? We've been down this road too many times. The sort of human rights violations that the CCP is perpetrating on a massive scale in this district should disqualify the PRC from global leadership. Such abuses contravene the most fundamental rights and basic personal freedoms, yet China remains one of the world's most influential countries, and because of this, few on the international stage are willing to speak out about the PRC's repression and internment of the Uyghurs and others. My hope is that today, with the assistance of our expert panel, we can begin to address this disparity and work towards options for the overdue U.S. policy response to this crisis. And with that, members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record subject to length limitations and rules, and the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the hearing. I will now turn to the ranking member for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today is a day when we focus in this room on China's war against Muslims. This morning in this room, we heard how China is aiding Myanmar, Burma, and their military in the either genocide or close to genocide of the Rohingya and the ethnic cleansing of hundreds of thousands or millions of individuals who have known no other home other than Burma. And this afternoon, we focus on China's domestic policy. China is repressing its Uyghur population in the province of Xinjiang on a massive scale. The Chinese government has, as noted in a recent UN meeting, turned Xinjiang into something resembling a massive internment camp shrouded in secrecy, a sort of no-rights zone. I look forward to learning more from our witnesses. What China's doing there is terrible. I don't know. I'd have to learn more before I'd endorse the chairman's use of the word extermination or crematoriums. But clearly, what we're seeing is hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million, being held in so-called re-education camps. The people running the government in Beijing are the sons, not so much the sons and daughters, but sons of those who were put into re-education camps during the Cultural Revolution. The fact that they would then turn and put 1 million people into re-education camps, concentration camps, detention camps, in this case, pretty much solely because of their ethnicity and religion, is absolutely outrageous. An article in Foreign Policy noted that the official purpose of the internment camps is to, quote, purify people's thoughts, eliminate extremism, and to instill support for the Communist Party. The idea that you could win friends among people by interning them strikes me as bizarre. Beyond this forced indoctrination, the internment camps allow police to physically remove people from society and then say, well, nobody on the streets of Xinjiang opposes the Communist Party. A report by Human Rights Watch mentions that in 2014, when China launched its so-called Strike Hard campaign against, quote, violent terrorism, the number of people arrested in Xinjiang has increased threefold compared to the previous 5-year period. Chinese repression dramatically scaled up in 2016 when the Communist Party secretary in Tibet relocated to assume leadership in Xinjiang. China is going after Uyghurs living abroad. There are accounts of Uyghurs being sent back by Middle East countries where they worked or lived in violation of international obligations, with these Middle Eastern countries knowing that those Uyghurs will be interned when they are sent back to the clutches of the Chinese government. Further, China suppresses the religious and cultural rights of Uyghurs, as the Amnesty International points out. Its regulations on religious affairs ban many religious activities, and this allows China to basic religious rights. The Chinese government limits the use of the Uyghur language. China detains ethnic Uyghur writers and websites, editors, etc. All these Chinese efforts to weaken and could lead to the elimination of Uyghur cultural identity. The ethnic balance in Xinjiang has changed dramatically. In 1949, that province was only 60% ethnic Chinese. Now it's 40% with its population, of the population with 75% of the capital. It's time to call out China. In August, I joined House and Senate colleagues in a letter to the Secretaries Pompeo and Mnuchin regarding this issue. We urge the application of the global Magnitsky Act sanctions against senior Chinese officials who oversee mass detention of Uyghurs. It called for sanctions against businesses assisting the Chinese officials in mass detention and asked the State Department to condemn these abuses. We ought to especially call out the Muslim countries that are saying nothing, whether that be Turkey, Pakistan, the Gulf states. It is simply outrageous that they do so little to help the Rohingya and turn their back completely on the Uyghurs. America should be given credit for protecting Muslims as we did in Bosnia, Kosovo. Now we're the #1 aid source for the Rohingya, and we are the leading voice for the protection of Uyghurs. And I notice that at the United Nations, if Israel builds one apartment building, huge fireworks, whereas China has moved millions of ethnic Chinese into this province, not a peep. And I'm not saying that every bit of construction done by Israel is consistent with a two-state solution, but it is interesting to see how a single apartment building can cause Muslim nations to speak in the most extreme terms and then be silent on what China is doing, both in its own borders and with regard to the Rohingya. I yield back.
I think this meeting's important because we're going to bring that out, the questions about whether or not their crematoriums is correct. I think that'll come out in this. The Uyghurs, we know, prefer burial. China prefers cremation, and we'll talk more about that. But at this time, with no objections, I'd like to turn to Ms. Comstock for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member. I really appreciate you holding this hearing today. As both the Chairman and Ranking Member have noted, this is something really important that needs a lot more attention. I'm sorry that this doesn't get more attention, but I appreciate you making the record here today and exploring this further. I wanted to speak also about, certainly associate myself with all the remarks previously made and talk about the horrible atrocities occurring in Northwest China, where reports have surfaced that Uyghurs and Kazakhs have been detained to re-education camps, forcing Muslims to renounce Islam and embrace the Communist Party. Additionally, reports have been made by reporters that have made it into the region, as well as those who escaped the camps and gone abroad, that Uyghurs are subject to torture, medical neglect, solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, and other deadly forms of abuse at these re-education camps. As a member of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and as somebody who worked with my predecessor, Congressman Frank Wolf, who I know worked with both of you on these important issues, it is extremely important to me that we bring greater light to these human rights abuses internationally, and especially when they regard the suppression of religious freedom. One of my constituents is here today. Furkat Jawadat is in attendance with his sisters and other members of his family. He is a U.S. citizen who has his home in Chantilly, Virginia, where he works for a government contractor providing support to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And we thank him for his service, and we thank him for being here today. He also has a 1-year-old daughter. However, his life has become a living nightmare since February 2018. Thank you for being here today. When his mother was sent to one of these re-education camps. He now does not know about her whereabouts, when she will be released, or why she was taken. You can imagine that nightmare, Mr. Chairman, and that's why I thank you so much for having this hearing and highlighting this. This is real to the people in my district, and I know throughout the country. He worries that she is being tortured, or worse, fears that she may already have been killed. We are working to bring this to the attention of Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Branstad, and Ambassador Sue Oy, asking for answers regarding his mother. We know he's not alone in his suffering. At least 1 million people have been detained in camps, and Uyghurs account for 21% of the arrests, despite making up only 1.5% of the population. Clearly, this is a religious freedom issue and atrocity. I am so grateful for this hearing today so that we can shed much needed light on this issue and work to find real solutions to this problem and the very human and tragic outcomes that we're seeing here. And I thank you again, for being here today. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady for her comments, and this is something that we want to expose. And the best way, you know, whenever these atrocities go on, is to expose it through witnesses, expose it through the media, and keep talking about it until we can get enough outrage from people to come out. You know, the thought of a re-education camps, I think, is something that should scare us. I think we've all heard of George Orwell's book, 1984. He missed the mark by about 34 years. You know, he talked about this, and to hear what's going on, I just got back from Mongolia, South Korea, and Japan. Still not sure what country I'm in. But to hear what the Chinese wanted to do in the Asia-Pacific region with the 5G network is something they can offer to other leaders of other countries and say, look what we can do. We can monitor your systems. We can rank your systems to see if they're a good Communist Party member or a bad one, and if they don't reach a certain level, we can send them to re-education camps. And I think that's going to come out more in this hearing. And so what I'd like to do now is, we're honored to have you guys here. And we're going to have you, I'm going to introduce you, and then you'll have 5 minutes to speak. And I think you all know how to use the system there. Turn your microphone on. The lights will go green, yellow, and red. It's 5 minutes. And we have Dr. Adrian Zenz, a noted expert on China's policy toward minority groups. Thank you for being here. Mr. Nuri Turkle, Chairman of the Board at the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and Dr. Justin Jacobs, an Associate Professor in the Department of History at American University. And before we start, does the gentleman from California have an opening statement?
Yes, I do, and let me apologize. This is one of the more frustrating parts about being a congressman. We got 3 hearings, all of which are really important at the same time.
And I've got a bill on the floor I'm supposed to be talking about.
Oh my gosh!
Don't worry.
But the people, the Uyghurs and the people of China should get the message that we are willing, even though we have really busy days, we're not too busy to come here to talk about their plight and what's going on in China and the type of, we have Muslims that are being murdered by the government of Burma. Now they call them the Myanmar now. But we have that type of slaughter of Islam. You have the slaughter of Islam in China as well. We need to make sure that the Muslim population of the world knows that we are not against their religion, and we are not against people who practice that religion. We are against the radical Islamic terrorists who basically attack the United States. But people who live and have lived in their societies for a long time throughout the planet, when they are under attack, which is what's happening in China, we are on the side of those people, whatever their religion is, and in this case, they happen to be Muslims. And the Uyghurs have played a very important role over the years because we've known them, I've met them. They are a very respectable part of that culture in that part of the world. But China, what the government of China today is behind, of course, the slaughter of the Muslims down in Burma. And they are also, the government of China, of course, is doing everything to do to stamp out the Uyghur movement in China. So with that said, I hope that our friends throughout the world get the word and understand what's happening today. We care about Muslim people in China. We care about them in Burma. We care about them when they're under attack. And it is not, and we don't want just war, this war mentality between Islam and Christianity. So, Mr. Chairman, by holding this hearing today, I appreciate and I applaud you for sending this positive message towards this big hunk of the world, that we can work together to make it a better world and respect each other's rights. So I will be running back and forth now between these two and three hearings that I'm involved in, but I will be watching on the monitor when I'm not here and reading your testimony otherwise. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher, and if you get a chance, talk on my bill on the House floor. Dr. Adrian Zen, please go ahead.
First, I would like to thank the chairman, the ranking member, and the other members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify about the situation in what China refers to as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The research performed by myself and others conclusively shows the existence of a large-scale extrajudicial detention network for the purpose of subjecting Xinjiang's Muslim minorities, but also some ethnic minority Christians, to intensive political re-education and indoctrination procedures. The evidence I gathered largely comes from the Chinese government itself: reports, budgets, bids, recruitment notices, along with corroborating evidence from satellite images. A detailed account of my research findings, including on large-scale police recruitments and the installation of extensive surveillance networks, provided in a written statement. All the information we have consistently points towards the fact that Xinjiang's unprecedented securitization and re-education campaign was inaugurated by the region's party secretary Chen Quanguo in spring 2017. In this campaign, up to 11 to 12% of Xinjiang's Muslim minority adult population has been detained in re-education camps, at times referred to as vocational skills training or simply training institutions. Public bid documents state that some of these so-called training facilities are heavily secured with high walls, fences, barbed wire, security cameras, reinforced doors and windows, and other security features typically found in detention centers or in prisons. Recruitment notices, likewise starting in spring 2017, indicate an unusually large intake of teachers for what is simply referred to as training facilities that only mandate a junior or senior secondary education along with Chinese language skills. Typically, vocational skills teachers in China, as well as in Xinjiang, are required to possess a tertiary degree in a relevant subject. Overall, it is reasonable to assume that Xinjiang's current re-education campaign exceeds the scale of the entire former national re-education through labor system, a system that was abolished in 2013 because the government itself considered it to be no longer appropriate for a modern society governed by the rule of law. It should be made clear that China has faced a credible terrorist threat from Uyghur resistance groups, and that measures against actual religious extremism are certainly in order for any nation facing such challenges. However, China's extra-legal internment of large shares of Xinjiang's Muslim minority population is tearing apart the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent people who have no splittist or extremist intentions and pursue harmless and appropriate cultural and religious practices. Chen Quanguo's re-education campaign is destroying the very fabric of Xinjiang's minority societies, separating families, leaving children orphaned, instilling fear and resentment, and sowing the seeds of hate. In the name of combating terrorism, this campaign constitutes a monstrous crime against humanity on a scale and level of sophistication that has only rarely been witnessed in modern history. Seasoned scholars who have studied the region for decades are appalled at what they perceive to be an unprecedented repression with unforeseeable long-term consequences. My recommendations are as follows. Firstly, that the United States government investigates whether American companies are involved in supplying technologies and products used in Chinese surveillance or other security-related systems that may also be deployed in Xinjiang. If so, the export of such products to China should be stopped. Secondly, to sanction the responsible Chinese officials, for example, through the global Magnitsky Act. The main effect of such sanctions may not necessarily be the sanctions themselves, but the symbolic force they exert and the resulting increase in public awareness. Thirdly, that the government would regularly and consistently speak up in regards to this issue in all relevant contexts, being aware of the fact that the suppression of core aspects of minority identities in Xinjiang is reflective of a wider campaign to systematically curtail social and religious freedoms among both minorities and the Han majority throughout China. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Next, we'll go to Mr. Turkle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to attend this hearing. It's an honor to be here before you. The Uyghur Human Rights Project commends the subcommittee for convening this hearing on the U.S. policy response. We would also like to express our appreciation to the subcommittee members who have co-signed the bipartisan letters calling for sanctions and urgent pressure for the release of the relatives of Uyghur American citizens. The human rights emergency facing Uyghur people in China requires an urgent response. For decades, the Chinese government implemented policies of racial discrimination, criminalization of Uyghurs' distinct ethnic and religious identity. In the 2 years since the new party secretary took office, we have seen how these policies paved the way for dehumanization of the Uyghur people. This should raise an urgent alarm about what is next for the Uyghur people in China. It is also important to be clear about the Chinese government's claim to be carrying out counterterrorism campaign, which is nonsense. Prior to 9/11, Chinese government justified repressive policies by claiming to be fighting separatism. Hundreds of political prisoners were locked away for expressing their identity or peacefully protesting government abuse and corruption. After 9/11, the same policies were suddenly recast as counterterrorism. Today, it's very clear that these policies have nothing to do with security concerns. Most obvious evidence is the large-scale facilities being built to keep Uyghur children under state control from preschool age. As we speak, millions of Uyghurs don't know if they will ever see their parents, sons, daughters, and their young nieces, nephews ever again. Finally, United States government must respond vigorously to threats and retaliation against the American citizens of Uyghur origin on U.S. soil. It is time to act. My recommendations for the Congress as follows. 1, to guide policy through the government, we urge the subcommittee to introduce a binding resolution endorsing an urgent U.S. policy response to the Uyghur crisis. The long overdue Uyghur Policy Act is needed to definitely state U.S. support for Uyghurs' civil and political rights and to mandate adequate measures to reverse the current crisis. The Congress should also press for an immediate congressional fact-finding visit to the Uyghur region. Ambassador Branstad should personally lead efforts for the release of the Uyghur American citizens' relatives in China. We also endorse the enforcement of the Magnitsky Act and the, going after the companies, individuals assisting the Chinese state security agencies. Congress should also review the U.S.-China law enforcement cooperation. American officials need to use this channel to vigorously raise the shocking treatment of Uyghurs by China's security forces. Law enforcement agencies should also investigate threats and retaliations carried out against Uyghur Americans and other Uyghurs living in the United States. United States should publicly affirm its policy not to extradite or deport Uyghurs living in the U.S. and urge other governments to join Germany and Sweden by publicly announcing a halt to all deportation of Uyghurs to China. 7, Congress should appropriate funds to support Uyghur human rights and civil society groups working to advance human rights and environmental protection in their homeland. 10, U.S. delegation at the United Nations should have strong congressional backing for vigorous action. China has been in a hot seat for its crimes against humanity in the Uyghur region exactly once in the last 19 months, which was August 10th at the third review panel in Geneva. Going forward, U.S. must field a strong delegation at China's UPR review on November 6th. Finally, we know of Uyghur students who cannot pay their tuition at American universities because their parents are detained in China. In this humanitarian urgency, members of Congress should support these students' requests for tuition waiver and scholarship. In conclusion, I'd like to reiterate my gratitude to the U.S. Congress for the bipartisan support and its effort to hold human rights abusers in China to account. Thank you again for the opportunity to shine more lights on the tragic situation facing the Uyghur people in China. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Turkle. Dr. Jacobs.
Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing on China's policies in Xinjiang and for inviting me to testify. From 1949 to 2001, the Chinese Communist Party generally regarded the mostly Muslim population of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region as deserving of some form of cultural autonomy within China. These long-standing views have come under sustained assault over the past 15 years, during which time China has been gradually accelerating its policies of cultural assimilation, intrusive surveillance, and unlawful detention of the Uyghur ethnic group, with a devastating intensification of the more coercive aspects of these measures in the past 2 to 3 years. Since 2009, a series of violent incidents appears to have convinced the Chinese Communist leadership that it must solve its so-called Uyghur problem in Xinjiang once and for all. The result is the oppressive security apparatus, arbitrary system of indefinite detention, and coercive assimilationist measures now on display in Xinjiang, all of which have been institutionalized and normalized in the past 2 years. Ever since the appointment of Chen Quanguo as party secretary of Xinjiang in 2016, surveillance and assimilationist policies previously tested in Chen's prior posting to Tibet have been greatly expanded and accelerated in Xinjiang. With regard to cultural assimilation, the elimination of bilingual education in minority languages such as Uyghur, a policy previously applied only at the university level, has now been instituted in primary and secondary schools as well. The state also provides new financial incentives for Han men to marry Uyghur women, and Uyghurs who wish to sell their property must apply for government permission to do so. Mosques are frequently closed down without explanation, and Islamic insignia, such as the crescent moon, have been removed from those that remain open. The euphemistic political re-education schools are now believed to be responsible for the arbitrary and indefinite incarceration of anywhere from several 100,000 up to 1 million Uyghurs, or between 3 to 10% of the entire population. It is clear that all members of the Uyghur ethnic group are being considered for mass internment in these camps. Leaked documents and press reports reveal the existence of mandatory quotas for internment. Chen Quanguo and Beijing appear to be committed to the permanent institutionalization and further expansion of these re-education camps, with evidence of massive construction projects continuing to leak to the outside world. Chinese leaders believe that their approach in Xinjiang is working. As a result, we should not expect to see any voluntary retrenchment or scaling back of the new measures on the part of Beijing. Indeed, this frightening dystopia did not originate in Xinjiang, and it will not end in Xinjiang. The United States is uniquely positioned to take on a global leadership role concerning this crisis. Not only have the major global powers mostly failed to confront China on its treatment of the Uyghur people, but even the leaders of majority Muslim countries have until recently tended to shy away from raising the issue with Beijing. Going forward, I believe that there are 4 policy options that may help to ameliorate a few of the worst abuses of the system and encourage Beijing to reevaluate its role in perpetuating a human rights crisis on a scale not seen in China since the days of Mao Zedong. First, in accordance with the Magnitsky Act, the United States should consider the adoption of sanctions against key members of the Chinese Communist Party associated with the implementation of the excessive and indiscriminate policies in Xinjiang. Second, the United States should call for the release of the hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs who have been unlawfully and arbitrarily detained in the so-called political re-education schools and other extra-legal facilities in Xinjiang. Third, the United States should urge the Chinese Communist leadership to avoid excessive and indiscriminate incarceration and surveillance measures that target entire religious and ethnic groups within China. And fourth, the United States should encourage China to uphold the provisions in its own constitution that provide for the cultural, linguistic, and religious autonomy of its minority groups. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members, for your attention and consideration.
I appreciate all of your comments, and I think your last statement is there, how China, their constitution says they should incorporate all this and they should be doing all this, but as we see over and over again, China leads by lie, deceit, and coercion. They say one thing, they do something else. It's like when they were telling President Obama in the Rose Garden that we are not militarizing the South China Sea on reclaimed lands that we cannot call islands, because islands denote ownership. It's reclaimed lands that we are not militarizing them, and we see over and over again they speak deception while they do underhanded things. Very dangerous place to be. And again, I can't think of anything more Orwellian on the planet than what China is doing. My notes here. I think you guys have all seen this Radio Free Asia report. Xinjiang rapidly building crematoriums to distinguish Uyghur funeral traditions, to extinguish Uyghur funeral traditions. It's a very disturbing report when you read through this about what they are doing. It says, amid concerns over expansion of the burial management centers in Shuar or Xinjiang, a job posting listed on the official government website for the region's capital, Uyghur, Urgimi, I can't pronounce that word, last month, can't pronounce a lot of the words, called for 50 security personnel with above average health who are physically and mentally fit, exceptionally brave, to work in the crematorium located in the city's district for a salary of more than 8,000 yen, and that is U.S. equivalent $1,215 per month. I think it's kind of interesting. 50 security personnel above average health who are physically and mentally fit to work in a crematorium. I think what we're seeing here is a repeat of what we've seen too many times in history. And shame on us, shame on the free world to turn a blind eye and not stand up to this. And how do you stand up to it? Can one nation stand up to it? Or does it take the world community realizing this, define it for what it is? And again, we've seen this in Syria, 400,000+ people have been slaughtered. We see what's going on with the Rohingya being slaughtered, and we see what China is doing, stepping up to create a pure race. Hitler wanted the Aryan race, obviously, and then we see Xi Jinping clearly articulated underlying in the Xinjiang region, where he said the aim of liberating thought is to better standardize thought. Then he goes on and says in the speech at the 19th CBC National Congress, he addressed the need for ethnic harmony to keep China on a path to success. Ethnic harmony. We must do more to safeguard China's sovereignty, security, and development interests, and staunchly oppose all attempts to split China or undermine its ethnic unity and social harmony and stability. And I think those are very clear things. They want everybody thinking the same way, on the same page, and that would be awesome if we could do that in every culture. And if you believe in what we stand for in this country with our Constitution, that rights come from a creator, not from government, that we institute government, we the people do, to protect our God-given rights, where in the Chinese party, they view the role of the citizen to serve the Communist Party. There is no higher authority in life in China than the Communist Party. And those that aren't following what the Chinese Communist Party says need to be sent to rethought camps or re-education camps. And henceforth, it requires to have crematoriums for those that don't, and so that they can extinguish that. What is the PRC's vision for ethnic harmony? We'll start with you, Dr. Zenz. Am I off on this, or are we seeing a repeat of Adolf Hitler in a different language?
My personal opinion on this issue, Mr. Chairman, is that China considers itself as a multi-ethnic nation or even empire in the past and under current CCP leadership. It's a superficially diverse multi-ethnic Chinese nation under the leadership of Chinese culture. In this context, China does not have any interest to destroy or eliminate an ethnic group, but rather to integrate and to assimilate. It's my belief that we are not looking at an intentional genocide in terms of the large-scale killing of an ethnic group. What I perceive is very consistent with communist practice to try to change a people. Here we see a communist attempt to change a people, particularly away from religion, which is not only limited to Uyghurs, but also to other religious groups in other parts of China. With the Uyghurs, it's being done with particular intensity due to the sensitive location and the fact that violent incidents have occurred. And on the second line, we also see an attempt to ethnically and linguistically assimilate a people into the core culture of the Chinese nation, which is the Han Chinese culture, which permits a certain remnant of ethnic culture to remain. People can speak their language to an extent. They can keep harmless cultural customs, although the space for that has been shrinking under the current Chinese regime. There was much more space for this under previous Chinese regimes. As a result, I believe we are looking at these camps at political re-education. These camps will naturally have higher mortality rates due to their conditions. People who are sick and elderly or suffer from mental conditions will naturally die quicker. We will have, therefore, higher mortality rates due to the conditions of these camps. I do not believe that there is an intent to systematically move into mass killing. Of course, I can be proven wrong, but if you ask my opinion, that's what it is. I also believe that the crematoria that are being built, that you refer to, all of China is moving towards cremation by 2020, not just Xinjiang. Of course, this has some very convenient side effects, besides saving room, of course, in a country with a high population density, although Xinjiang province, Xinjiang Autonomous Region does not have a high population density. It does restrict and eliminate religious practice related to funeral. Many religions, of course, including Islam, have very important funeral rites of spiritual and religious importance. So there's another way to encroach upon a territory occupied by religion. And another aspect is, of course, that if people do die in re-education camps or other detention facilities, it is very convenient to cremate them because you do not have anybody attending the funeral. You can then choose to tell and inform the family members at a later stage.
Let me stop you there for the
I'm
sake
done
of
in
time.
any case.
Huh?
I was going to be done. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate that, and I want to come back to that. At this time, we'll go to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I'm glad to, when I heard crematorium next to concentration or internment camps, one harkens back to the Nazis where they were not cremating those who had died, they were using crematorium in order to kill. That being said, are there, Dr. Zenz, are there funerals and burials taking place in in the province now, or are they forcing Uyghurs to use cremation instead?
We are seeing, I think there is limited empirical information on the matter, but the evidence we have would be consistent with what is being sought to be implemented in the rest of the nation to shift towards cremation.
Push people
Yes,
in,
which is
in
forced.
that direction.
Which is forced. It's not voluntary. And particularly in Xinjiang.
So my guess, someone will be buried today who died of natural causes, but another family might be pushed into accepting cremation as opposed to burial or Islamic burial.
That is very much the trend we're
There's
seeing,
here, there's
especially in
there.
Xinjiang. Yes.
Yeah, I'm talking only in Xinjiang.
Yes.
I don't know which witness to ask, but Turkey used to be an advocate for what is called East Turkmenistan. Is Turkey continuing to advocate for the Uyghurs, or are they have they backed off? Does anyone know?
I'd be happy
Mr.
to
Turk.
address that question. Before addressing your important question, I'd like to point out the unstated goal of the Chinese government under this claim that they working to achieve social stability. In any under any wildest imagination, you don't achieve social stability by calling somebody's ethnicity or ethnic cultural appreciation as a tumor, religion as a mental disease. It makes no sense in any.
Okay. If you could focus on my question.
And then, in addressing your question, Turkey has been historically supportive of the Uyghur struggle for cultural, linguistic, and historic reasons. In 2009, the current Turkish president said that he think what is happening in East Turkestan is a sort of genocide, knowing the genocide word is a very sensitive word in Turkey. But in the last couple years, Turkish government has taken 180 degrees turn, has become very close to the Chinese government. Specifically, they signed extradition treaty, and also the Turkish foreign minister in Beijing stated that Turkey will not be allowed for anti-China activities. Having said that, if you flip through any newspapers published in Turkey, you'll be hard-pressed to find anything on the ongoing madness in East Turkestan today.
So they've gone from supportive to deliberately influencing their newspapers to not even report what China is doing to these Turkic peoples. What about Pakistan? Have they been willing to speak out for the Uyghurs?
Pakistan has also have a horrible history collaborating with China.
Which Muslim government or
Unfortunately,
a government of a Muslim country has been the loudest and most dedicated to protecting the Uyghurs?
Unfortunately, none as we speak. Only Malaysian leader Anwar Ibrahim recently expressed concern. That's pretty much about it.
Expressed concern, but none of them have sanctioned any Chinese leaders
None,
or
unfortunately.
sanctioned Chinese businesses. Which religious customs or rights is China prohibiting?
The Chinese government sanctioned pretty much everything related to Islam, especially in the last 19 months.
So if you don't eat during daylight in Ramadan, what will they do to
Foreign
you?
Policy magazine listed 48 ways that you'll be considered as extremist in the eyes of the Chinese government under this new draconian regulation imposed April 2017 that sanctioned a normal beard, adherence to Islamic diet.
You mean eating halal food makes you an Islamic extremist?
This is under their new regulation. Their policy papers been written, their reports have been published on this particular issue. Foreign Policy magazine lists 48 behaviors that you and I...
And the Foreign Policy magazine is translating a Chinese regulation
That's
that
correct.
says you are classified an Islamic extremist and subject to internment if you eat halal food.
Even greeting in Islamic way. Today, Uyghur families cannot even say Assalamu alaikum as part of their culture.
So they're basically prohibiting the practice of Islam while not allowing perhaps a vague Islamic cultural identity. and the Muslim nations of the world lift not a finger.
That's the ironic world that we find ourselves today, unfortunately.
I yield back.
Next, we'll go to Mr. Rohrabacher from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask the panel, didn't Mao have a period of time after he took over where he, was it let 1,000 flowers bloom or something like that? Do you remember what I'm talking about? And apparently there was, in order to calm people down about this new power structure in China, he came off as if that, well, it's not going to be so bad after all. And then when all the flowers began to bloom, meaning all of the people began coming out and expressing what they really believed about communism and about life, he had mass arrests. And after that, they had, of course, that effort that happened in the 60s where they just, a cultural revolution, and just wiped all those people out who had exposed themselves to something other than the communist ideology. Well, what it sounds like to me is that what we have now, we're let 1,000 flowers bloom. I was right. Okay. But what we seem to be having now, and what you're describing, is that the Chinese government is going through another period where it is clamping down in order to stamp out those forces in society, especially those containing religion, like the Uyghurs have that part of their culture. They're trying to stamp that out in order to secure that they themselves from any opposition based on that cultural difference. Does that pretty well sound like we're going through that phase? So it sounds like to me, especially when I hear your testimony talking about how there are relocation camps and there is an infrastructure being built to brutally eliminate the Uyghur tradition in that part of China, just eliminate it from the world. And so we thank you to being here and giving us those details. And I was listening to what you had to say, and that's very, I would say it's frightening, but it's consistent with what, frankly, those of us who've been worrying about China and the communist government of China, and by, I don't even know if you can call it a communist government, it's just a vicious, one of the most iron-fisted dictatorships in the world. And whether or not how they think about Marx or Lenin is irrelevant to that. However, when you have a group that might be opposing that, who has a religious conviction, the Uyghurs are finding that out now, but you've had the Falun Gong, as you know, have had a very, very peaceful-oriented philosophy, or a spiritualist-type philosophy. They're being brutally repressed, being murdered, and their organs are sold to Westerners at times. And then, as I say, we got the Rohingyas down in Burma, and the Chinese are actually the ones who have organized and armed the Burmese government and the military to go down there and commit the genocide that is taking place with the Rohingyas. So I hope that we get the attention of some of the people on, number one, your suggestions, whichever one it was, about activating the Magnitsky Act is a good idea. When you have people committing crimes against humanity, now I disagreed with the title, Magnitsky, but I certainly agreed with the substance of what that act was all about and is all about. We should do that. We should actually, but most importantly, what your testimony is as well, Mr. Chairman, is we got to make sure American corporations aren't being involved with providing the technology needed for this repression, this wave of repression to succeed in China. And some of our own companies need to be held accountable. One last question. We were mentioning about countries that have stepped forward. Has not Albania stepped forward and taken in a group of Uyghurs, or am I mistaken about that?
Thank you very much. May I address your question? Good to see you, Congressman Rohrabacher. We've known each other quite a long time. Albania has not stepped up. Albania took some Guantanamo, the Uyghurs being detained in Guantanamo years ago. But Kosovo, interestingly enough, after the ministerial that Secretary Pompeo organized several weeks ago, is one of the countries, along with UK, Canada, and the United States, to sign on the joint statement. That's the only Muslim
Okay,
country.
so Kosovo has, but
Not Albania.
Albania has not?
Not yet.
So, okay, I'll check that out. Let me just note that I've been told a number of times that Albania and the Kosovars have been done, but Albania was in particular was mentioned to me. So we'll look into that, Mr. Chairman. That may be something the committee can verify, and I appreciate that information.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today. I'm going to run to that other hearing, and then to the vote, and then to the other thing. So, sorry, I can't stay for the whole thing.
You'll be in shape at the end of the day.
Okay.
So where do we go from here? Again, we don't normally have people give comments. If you can give just one comment, and this is the only time we're going to do it, so don't anybody else raise your hand, and keep it short, please. Let me address that after Mr. Shabbat's. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be very brief. I'm trying to do two things at once here. I apologize. I was in the back room with a meeting with some folks from Puerto Rico. Which one is it here? I don't know what thing it is. I had it, but it got turned over for the meeting back there. Again, I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for letting us go next. Let me begin by just saying, having served as the chair of this subcommittee for a number of years, and having traveled through the region that's, well, the Asia-Pacific region a number of times, I think many of us are very aware of China's terrible human rights record. And the case in Xinjiang is truly Orwellian. Uyghurs are routinely subjected to the most extreme and really absurd surveillance. They face random checks, restricted freedom of movement, and they cannot travel abroad. Worse, authorities have made extensive use of video surveillance, facial recognition, and artificial intelligence to track every Uyghurs' every move. Most dystopian of all, authorities also maintain detailed records on Uyghurs, including DNA samples, eye scans, and blood types. Unfortunately, Beijing has spread its repression well beyond Xinjiang. Uyghurs around the world, including here in America, often face threats to their families at home unless they comply with Chinese authorities' demands and help monitor fellow Uyghurs. Beijing claims to be worried about terrorism, but every country faces counterterrorism challenges without locking up over 1 million people. And the bottom line is Beijing is terrorizing their Uyghur population, and it's just unacceptable. So just a couple of questions, and I would welcome any of the gentlemen here to respond. Over the past couple of years, the situation in Xinjiang has worsened considerably. And we know that China's economic influence is quite comprehensive and can be pretty daunting. And Mr. Sherman got in this to some extent, but I'd like to go a little bit further. And I would ask, to what extent has this influence caused other countries, particularly some of the larger Muslim population countries, to overlook or refrain from public criticism China's treatment of the Uyghurs? And I would offer that to anybody who might. Mr. Turkle, you might be the best person because you touched on it before.
There are a couple of possible ways to answer that question. One is to those Muslim countries, it appears that the Uyghurs happen to be a wrong type of Muslim to show sympathy.
You said the wrong kind of Muslim?
Yeah, and then the other possibility is that China happened to be the wrong type of adversary for them to take on. And then finally, this committee held a hearing about Chinese coercive influence campaign that have been very effective in the Muslim countries. There was a question about Pakistan. Pakistan has been very supportive of Chinese effort to silence the Pakistani Uyghur citizens even. And in the Gulf states, particularly UAE, Egypt, has a horrible track record of deporting Uyghur students, which has been also reported by various media outlets. And the Malaysia, in a previous administration, has also deported some Uyghurs. In the refugee issues, they have been very, very cooperative with the Chinese government. But on the moral issues, they have been looking the other way.
Thank you. And I think I've got time for one more question, Mr. Chairman. It's my understanding that some members of the Uyghur diaspora have been targeted by Chinese authorities. And I would ask, how have Chinese authorities sought to co-opt or coerce or punish members of the Uyghur diaspora around the world, and particularly here in the United States?
They use two different methods. One, they use their remaining family members of China as a leverage against the free Uyghurs who has citizenship in Europe, in North America. So by using their family members, they silence public criticism. And then we had also recently Voice of America that are reporting on a public event here in Washington, D.C. It specifically states that none of the Uyghurs who spoke with the reporter were comfortable disclosing their names. I can assure you that many Uyghurs today living, breathing in this free country, afraid of coming to this hearing.
Yeah.
So the Chinese export of its oppression and the psychological damage, emotional damage, the crippling anxiety that they have caused is immeasurable in various communities, particularly in the Western societies.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I could just conclude, I mean, I think what was just said, it's very disturbing when one considers that people would be fearful, people living here in the United States would be fearful to come to a hearing before the United States Congress because of what might happen across the globe to their relatives back home. And I think that the administration ought to look into this, and we ought to do everything possible to make sure that people know that in the United States it truly is a place to be free, and one ought not to have to worry about their relatives being harmed back home from the PRC or anybody else. I yield back.
No, I think you're very, very spot on. But you know, you look at the long arm, the reach of the Chinese government now with the intelligence they have, with the technology, and then look into the future when we get closer to perfecting or artificial intelligence, and then put in quantum computing. That'll be light years of where we are today. The control they can have on society over here for the people back home, as you just said, they'll be afraid to speak up. And I find it very disturbing because again, we've seen this throughout history. You know, if you don't fall in line with the government, we want you to report. We want you to report your neighbors. On these so-called re-education camps, and the only place I know of them in modern time were in Nazi Germany, in North Korea, and now we see them in China. Have you guys talked to many people that have ever come out of the re-education camp? I mean, what is the average time in a re-education camp, and how many people come out? Mr. Turkle?
Not many. We have only a handful of former detainees whom have been speaking with Western media. There's a Kazakh citizen who has been testifying and told us the stories of 11-month ordeal. He's a Kazakh citizen traveling in China, and he came out and described his experience in those camps, and his parents had been taken away. And he apparently could not continue to live in Kazakhstan, recently have been relocated to Turkey. And Radio Free Asia recently went to Turkey to interview the actual victims of those detention facilities, and their accounts have been heart-wrenching, going through torturous condemnation, denunciation, renunciation of their identity, watching so-called anti-separatist videos, praising Xi Jinping, singing red songs, very poor health condition, diet. Even today, last night I read a Radio Free Asia report about 32-year-old young woman died in one of those detention facilities. And earlier, Radio Free Asia also reported 82-year-old Islamic scholar who was apparently tortured to death in prison. And as reported recently, his entire family have been taken away. And one thing that we need to point out here, the Chinese government is attacking Uyghur intellectuals, elites, business leaders, musicians, athletes. Just reported last night again by Radio Free Asia, the vice president of Xinjiang University, former president of Xinjiang University, Medical University, and the 4 top officials at Kashgar University all have been taken away. And the person who was in charge of educational affairs, reportedly by Radio Free Asia, imposed death penalty, I literally cannot come up with a better word to
It's just hard to comprehend it. Yes. Does Dr. Jacobs, anybody else have any comments on that? Dr. Zenz?
If I may go ahead, I would add to this that the information we have on this is fairly limited, but what we do have is very consistent. The information is consistent that people go in, more and more people go in, very few people go out. Numbers are increasing. I should also point out that in 2014 and 15, the re-education system for de-extremification grouped Uyghurs into 4 groups, and the most hardened, stubborn, and dangerous received 20 days of re-education. These days, it's unheard of that anybody would be detained on no crime at all, no suspicion, no charge, no nothing whatsoever, and be released in as quickly as 20 days. It's unheard of.
Yeah, I just find it extremely frightening. Dr. Jacobs, do you have any other comments?
The only other evidence that we've had are from people who come out and they then toe the party line as well. And you'll get this utopian account of how great the camps are.
Right.
And they'll come out saying, you know, this was necessary and I'm a better person now. The only way you're going to get contrary testimony to that is by people who have been able to leave China and are not afraid of family members back home suffering repercussions.
Right. I want to address our audience back there that wanted to make a statement. Unfortunately, I can't do that because we didn't have prior permission from both sides. We'll be happy to get a statement that we can enter into this and maybe read it at a future one. Not to slight you or anything, but we are, you know, we checked on the rules and that, and I can't do that. You know, again, I just don't want to sound like a broken record. We've seen this too many times in history, and we see what China is trying to do to create a one China, one mindset, one culture, yet they're going after the people of Tibet, trying to rewrite history, trying to erase that culture. We've seen that in other parts of China, trying to erase that. We see that with the Uyghurs. We see where they're going with this new technology to get people to toe the line. If you don't toe the line, you go to the re-education camps. The way we understand it, there's been over 1 million people put into these. We know the party elites that don't toe the party line are put into re-education camps, and we know they have over 1 million of those, but very few come out. It's like that song of the Eagles, Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out. And, you know, the thought that we're repeating those atrocities of the past are very disturbing, And with the DNA and the retinal scans and things that they're tracking people of, there's a U.S. company, Thermo Fisher, I understand, that's involved in the genetic testing equipment used for force tests. Do you guys have any ideas of what Congress should do with any company that is involved in having their equipment involved in this? Sanction them, bring them, you know, get the word to them, don't participate? Dr. Zenz?
I think some companies may not fully realize what is going on or what it means to sell equipment to Xinjiang. Maybe they should be realizing by now, but I think the first item would be a significant awareness raising in the public and amongst, of course, companies. Elevate the issue and then issue relevant decisions on it. But I think especially the publicity, the awareness, and also the cost involved.
No, I think that's a great idea, and that's something that we can do on this committee. And if you guys are aware of any other companies involved in their equipment being used in this, and it's like you said, they may not even know. But if we can get that to them and bring an attention to this, I would think our companies would say, you're not using our equipment. I find this shocking. You know, this is deeper than I thought. The control that China is doing, and you know, some of the reports I read that they talk about there is no higher power than the Chinese government, no deity, nothing else. And I'm so glad that we're in this country where we realize our rights come from a creator, not from the government, and that China wants to turn everybody into a policing state, and then they have the technology to make sure that they can follow through with that. What we plan to do on this committee, and it's happened so many times, the information we deem from you will go into resolutions, letters to the different companies, different entities that are involved in this, and we've got some good results out of this. You know, we've got the Cambodia Democracy Act that Hun Sen would never, their cronies around him said would never go anywhere. Their media attacked us, yet that bill got passed here in the House, and we're going to continue to do things like that. The DPRK Act, the Taiwan Travel Act, those are all things that came out of committee hearings like this that we put pressure on those countries, and we're going to continue to do that. Again, I just find this very disturbing, and I hope anybody that's listening to this, that's in this audience, you see George Orwell's 1984. It is here, and it is real, and this is the beginning of something that could be really catastrophic for the rest of the world. And I think this is something that we need to get the message out for the family members that are here. You're practicing Uyghurs and you have family members either left in China that are going through this process. You know, stay strong, keep the word out there, keep us informed. It's shining the light on it through committee hearings like this, getting on the news, and I know you put yourself at risk or your family at risk, but if we go down the road and we do nothing, we will look back and have the regrets, and we just want to make sure we don't make those regrets of the past. With that, this meeting is adjourned. I appreciate everybody being here, and thank you for your input.
What did Don